Welcome to the second video about the life of Haydn. We begin our tale with Haydn in Esterhazys on the precipice of international fame, thanks to his new employment contract that allowed him to sell his works. Don't forget to watch the first video in the series, linked in the eye and in the description box below. Now, back to Esterhazys. The remoteness of Esterhazys led Haydn to gradually feel more isolated and lonely. He longed to visit Vienna because of his friendships there. Of these, a particularly important one was with Maria Anna von Griesinger, the wife of Prince Nicholas's personal physician in Vienna, who began a close platonic relationship with the composer in 1789. Haydn wrote to Miss Griesinger often, expressing his loneliness at Esterhazys and his happiness for the few occasions on which he was able to visit her in Vienna. Later on, Haydn wrote to her frequently from London. Her premature death in 1793 was a blow to Haydn, and his F minor variations for piano may have been written in response to her death. Another friend in Vienna was Mozart, whom Haydn had met sometime around 1784. According to later testimony by Michael Kelly and others, the two composers occasionally played in string quartets together. Haydn was hugely impressed with Mozart's work and praised it unstintingly to others. In 1790, Prince Nicholas died and was succeeded as prince by his son Anton. Following a trend of the time, Anton sought to economize by dismissing most of the court musicians. Haydn retained a nominal appointment with Anton at a reduced salary of 400 florins, as well as a 1,000 florin pension from Nicholas. Since Anton had little need of Haydn's services, he was willing to let him travel, and the composer accepted a lucrative offer from Johann Peter Salomon, a German violinist and impresario, to visit England and conduct new symphonies with a large symphony orchestra. The choice was a sensible one because Haydn was already a very popular composer in England. Since the death of Johann Christian Bach in 1782, Haydn's music had dominated the concert scene in London. Hardly a concert did not feature a work by him. Haydn's work was widely distributed by publishers in London. Efforts to bring Haydn to London had been undertaken since 1782, though Haydn's loyalty to Prince Nicholas had prevented him from accepting. Even though he was traveling and being feted every night with balls, musical productions, and dinners, Haydn still found time to compose. He created and premiered some of his best-known works, including the Surprise, Military, Drum Roll, and London Symphonies, the Rider Quartet, and the Gypsy Rondo Piano Trio. The Surprise Symphony, number 94, derives its nickname because of the slow movement. It states its deceptively simple theme, first piano, or softly, then pianissimo, even softer, before jolting the listener with a wholly unexpected fortissimo, or very loud, stroke from the whole orchestra. It was another instance of Haydn's love of practical jokes appearing in his musical output. Let's hear the variation form slow movement of Symphony 94, The Surprise. On the way to England the first time, Haydn stopped in Bonn around Christmas time and was introduced to a young Beethoven. Haydn saw some of his work and promised to teach Beethoven when he returned from England. He kept this promise and taught Beethoven during his early years in Vienna. Haydn took Beethoven with him to Eisenstadt for the summer between London trips, where Haydn had little to do, and taught Beethoven some counterpoint. Beethoven, in his later years, consciously tried to become more of a popular composer than Haydn was in his lifetime. Beethoven chased the level of fame that Haydn had generated over years of publication in Vienna and beyond. Haydn returned to Vienna after his second trip to England in 1795. Prince Anton had died, and his successor, Nicholas II, proposed that the Esterhazy musical establishment be revived, with Haydn serving again as Kapellmeister. Haydn took up the position on a part-time basis. He spent his summers with the Esterhazys in Eisenstadt, and over the course of several years wrote 6 masses for them. By this time, Haydn had become a public figure in Vienna. He spent most of his time in his home, a large house in the suburb of Windemühl, and wrote works for public performance. In collaboration with his librettist and mentor Gottfried van Swieten, and with funding from van Swieten's Gesellschaft der Association, he composed his 2 great oratorios, The Creation and The Seasons. Both were enthusiastically received. Haydn frequently appeared before the public, often leading performances of The Creation and The Seasons for charity benefits, including the Tonkluster Societat programs with massed musical forces. He also composed instrumental music, the popular trumpet concerto, and the last 9 of his long series of string quartets, including The Fifths, Emperor, and Sunrise. Directly inspired by hearing audiences sing God Save the King in London, in 1797 Haydn wrote the patriotic Emperor's Hymn, God Save Emperor Francis. This achieved great success, and Haydn personally loved the work, playing it on the piano almost daily. The melody was used for von Falserleben's Deutschlandlied, which was written as part of the German unification movement and whose 3rd stanza is today the national anthem of the Federal Republic of Germany. During the later years of this successful period, Haydn faced incipient old age and fluctuating health, and he had to struggle to complete his final works. His last major work, from 1802, was the 6th Mass for the Esterhazys, the Heinemann Messe. By the end of 1803, Haydn's condition had declined to the point where he became physically unable to compose. He suffered from weakness, dizziness, inability to concentrate, and painful swollen legs. Since diagnoses were uncertain in Haydn's time, it is unlikely that the precise illness can ever be identified, although it is suggested that it was arterial sclerosis. The illness was especially hard for Haydn because the flow of fresh musical ideas continued unabated, although he could no longer work them out as compositions. Haydn was well cared for by his servants and received many visitors and public honors during his last years, but they could not have been very happy years for him. A final triumph occurred on the 27th of March, 1808, when a performance of The Creation was organized in his honor. The very frail composer was brought into the hall on an armchair to the sound of trumpets and drums, and was greeted by Beethoven, Salieri, who led the performance, and other musicians and members of the aristocracy. Haydn was both moved and exhausted by the experience and had to depart at intermission. This scene was the subject of a stationery box lid painted in watercolors by Balthazar Wigand. It depicts the large forces of the performance of The Creation, orchestra and chorus, the accumulated patrons, and all of the great musicians in attendance looking at Haydn in the center. It represented the gravity well that was Haydn's international reputation in his old age. The musical world orbited around his genius. The Creation, the work at this benefit concert, is one of Haydn's most popular works. The oratorio is scored for 3 vocal soloists, soprano, tenor, and bass, 4-part chorus, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and a large classical orchestra. The oratorio is structured in 3 parts. The first deals with the creation of light, of heaven and earth, of the sun and the moon, of the land and water, and of plants. The second treats the creation of animals and of man and woman. The final part describes Adam and Eve during their happy time in the Garden of Eden, portraying an idealized love in harmony with the new world. One of the most striking parts of the Creation is the depiction of chaos at the top of the oratorio. The overture is in C minor in a slow tempo, written in sonata form. Haydn depicts chaos by withholding musical cadences from the ends of phrases, continuously ratcheting up the tension to be released in the next section. It was an inspiration to later composers, and it sounds much ahead of its time due to the unresolved cadences. Let's hear a bit of the introduction to The Creation, the depiction of chaos. Haydn lived after the creation for another 14 months. His final days were hardly serene, as in May 1809, the French army under Napoleon launched an attack on Vienna, and on the 10th of May bombarded his neighborhood. According to Greisinger, 4 case shots fell, rattling the windows and doors of his house. He called out in a loud voice to his alarmed and frightened people, "Don't be afraid, children. Where Haydn is, no harm can reach you." But the spirit was stronger than the flesh, for he had hardly uttered the brave words when his whole body began to tremble. More bombardments followed until the city fell to the French on the 13th of May. Haydn was, however, deeply moved and appreciative when on the 17th of May, a French cavalry officer named Sulemi came to pay his respects and sang skillfully an aria from the Creation. On the 26th of May, Haydn played his Emperor hymn with unusual gusto 3 times. The same evening, he collapsed and was taken to what proved to be his deathbed. He died peacefully in his own home at 12:40 a.m. on the 31st of May, 1809, age 77. On the 15th of June, a memorial service was held in the Schlottenkirche in which Mozart's Requiem was performed. Haydn's remains were interred at the local Hunstrom cemetery until 1820, when they were moved to Eisenstadt by Prince Nicholas. His head took a different journey. It was stolen by phrenologists shortly after burial, and the skull was reunited with the other remains only in 1954, now interred in a tomb in the North Tower of Bergenkirche. For a musician that spent most of his professional life in a rural outpost in Hungary, Haydn had an international reputation that was remarkable. His compositions were played all around Europe during his lifetime, with little to no promotion by Haydn until his 50s. He became the first and arguably the most famous musician in Europe during his lifetime. He pioneered the forms of the string quartet and composed some of the first masterworks for the symphony. He was unstintingly generous to his contemporaries and his competitors, garnering him the nickname Papa Haydn in his late years. His international reputation dimmed in the century after his life because his works were synonymous with the classical style, rapidly going out of fashion at the turn of the next century. A Haydn revival was seen in the 1900s, with more of his works and his letters published by scholars. His works, especially the Creation, are played by orchestras all over the world. Thank you for joining me in this video series about the life of Haydn. I had a great time putting these together for you, and I hope you learned as much as I did. I've left a link to my website in the description box below, where you find the bibliography for this video. Also in the description box is a link to my Patreon, where you can support the making of these videos. Thanks again, and see you next time.